She was the belle of Creed, destined for a millionaire's mansion. Instead, she stood in the freezing mud and traded her life away to a ragged outcast who didn't even own shoes. They called him a savage. They didn't know he was a king, and the sky was his throne. The year was 1892, and the silver boomtown of Creed, Colorado, was a festering wound of greed and desperation carved into the San Juan Mountains. For Josephine Miller, the town had transformed from a promised land into a prison. Her father, Thomas Miller, had been one of the founding merchants, a proud man who had built a mercantile empire out of canvas tents and rough-hewn timber. But the impending silver panic had cast a long, suffocating shadow, and Thomas had made a fatal miscalculation, borrowing heavily from the cruelest man in the territory, Arthur Caldwell. Caldwell was a ruthless financier tied to the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. He did not merely want Thomas Miller's money, he wanted complete dominion over the valley, and above all, he wanted Josephine. With her sharp emerald eyes and an untamed spirit that polite society had failed to break, Josephine was the ultimate prize in a town built on dirt and sweat. The hammer fell on a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. Thomas Miller had defaulted. Caldwell, backed by 3 hired guns with iron expressions, dragged Thomas into the muddy thoroughfare of Main Street. A crowd of miners, prospectors, and saloon women formed a silent, breath-smoking ring around them. "The debt is $7,000, Thomas," Caldwell drawled, adjusting the lapels of his tailored wool coat. He looked out of place among the grime, like a vulture dipped in velvet. "The bank takes the store, the bank takes your home. And since federal law permits the jailing of fraudulent debtors, the marshal here will be taking you." Josephine pushed through the crowd, her skirts heavy with freezing mud. "You set him up, Arthur. You manipulated the freight costs to bankrupt him." Caldwell turned his cold, gray eyes to her. A terrifyingly polite smile touched his lips. "Business is a harsh mistress, Miss Miller. But there is an alternative. A simple signature on a marriage certificate. Become my wife, Josephine. The debt vanishes, and your father spends his twilight years in comfort rather than a federal penitentiary." The town held its breath. It was a brutal, medieval ultimatum happening in the shadow of American progress. Josephine looked at her father, who was weeping silently into his dirt-stained hands. If she married Caldwell, her life would be a gilded cage governed by a monster. But she had no money, no allies, and no way out, unless she destroyed her own value. Under the territorial homestead laws, a married woman's assets and debts were immediately consolidated with her husband's, and a creditor could not lay claim to a woman whose husband took on the physical liability of the debt. If Caldwell wanted to own her to get to the property, she needed a husband who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Her desperate gaze swept the crowd, passing over cowards and drunkards, until it landed on a solitary figure standing near the livery stable. It was Caleb O'Rourke. The town called him the Mountain Ghost. He was a towering, broad-shouldered hermit who lived somewhere above the timberline, far beyond where the mining trails ended. He came down to Creed only once a month to trade pelts for salt and gunpowder. He was clad in rough-stitched wolfskins and faded canvas. His dark hair was long and wild, framing a face chiseled by wind and sun, heavily scarred across the left cheek. He was universally known as the poorest, most dangerous savage in the county. He didn't even own a horse. Josephine didn't think. She acted on pure, terrified instinct. She marched through the mud, stopping inches from the towering mountain man. He smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and freezing rain. His eyes, a piercing, unnerving shade of ice blue, looked down at her with calm indifference. "You," Josephine said, her voice shaking but carrying across the dead-silent street. "What is your name?" "Caleb," he answered. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "Caleb," she said, raising her voice for Caldwell and the town to hear. "If you marry me, right here, right now, I will sign over the deed to the Miller claim in the High Pass. It's useless for silver, but it's land. In exchange, you take on my father's liability, and you take me away from this town." The crowd erupted into murmurs of shock. Caldwell's smug smile vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl. "Josephine, stop this lunacy. He is a beggar." He couldn't pay a 10-cent debt, let alone $7,000. Caleb looked at Josephine, his expression unreadable. He saw the sheer terror hiding behind her defiant green eyes. Slowly, the mountain man reached into the deep leather pouch tied to his hip. He didn't pull out coins or paper money. He pulled out a solid raw chunk of an unknown shimmering blue-gold ore the size of a man's fist. It caught the weak winter sunlight, fracturing the beams into blinding prisms. Even the seasoned miners in the crowd gasped. No one had ever seen a metal like it. Caleb tossed the heavy stone directly at Arthur Caldwell. The financier fumbled, catching it against his chest with a grunt. "Debts paid," Caleb said. The authority in his voice sent a shiver down Josephine's spine. It wasn't the voice of a beggar. It was the voice of a man who commanded the earth itself. Before Caldwell could recover from the shock of the mysterious treasure in his hands, Josephine grabbed the arm of the trembling town reverend. "Marry us, now, by proxy of the territorial governor." With Caldwell temporarily paralyzed by greed and confusion, the hurried, frantic vows were exchanged in the freezing street. Josephine Miller became Josephine O'Rourke. She had saved her father, but as she looked up at the towering, wild man who was now her husband, she realized she had just chained herself to a total stranger. "We leave," Caleb said quietly, not looking at the stunned townsfolk. Before the wolves remember how to bite, they did not take the established trails. Within an hour of the impromptu wedding, Josephine found herself dragging her feet through thigh-deep snow, ascending the brutal, jagged inclines of the San Juan Mountains. She had traded her velvet dress for her father's heavy canvas hunting coat and a pair of oversized leather boots, but the cold still clawed at her bones. Behind them, the smoke of Creed faded into the valley, but Josephine knew Caldwell would not be satisfied. The blue-gold ore Caleb had thrown at him would only ignite the financier's endless greed. He wouldn't just want the debt paid anymore. He would want the mountain the ore came from. Her fears were confirmed when the sharp, echoing crack of a Winchester rifle rang out from the valley below. "Pinkertons," Caleb muttered, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Caldwell hired trackers. They're fast." "We can't outrun horses on foot," Josephine panted, her lungs burning in the thin altitude. "They'll kill you and drag me back." Caleb stopped and looked at her. For the first time, she truly studied his face. The scar on his cheek wasn't from a bar fight, it looked like a burn, shaped almost like a geometric brand. "They can't ride horses where we're going," he said softly. Then, without asking, he scooped her up into his massive arms as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling, and began to run. He didn't run like a man fleeing. He moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of a predator. He navigated sheer drops, leaping across icy crevasses that would have swallowed a normal man. For 2 grueling days, they pushed higher into the forbidden zones of the Rockies, into the dead peaks where no maps existed. By the evening of the second day, a vicious blizzard struck. The wind howled like screaming women, blinding them in a curtain of white. The sound of the Pinkerton trackers' dogs barking echoed eerily up the canyon walls, dangerously close. Josephine's vision began to blur from hypothermia. She felt Caleb press her against a solid wall of freezing rock. "It's a dead end," she whispered, her tears freezing on her cheeks. They were trapped in a box canyon, surrounded by 200-foot cliffs of sheer granite. The dogs were howling just a few hundred yards below. "There are no dead ends," Caleb replied over the roaring wind. "Only doors people forgot how to open." He reached his bare hand into a crevice in the ice-covered rock wall. Josephine watched in disbelief as Caleb pressed his palm against a smooth, dark stone hidden deep within the fissure. A deep, mechanical groan reverberated beneath their feet. It wasn't the sound of a natural cave-in. It was the grinding of massive, ancient gears. The cliff face shuddered. A massive slab of stone, perfectly disguised as natural rock, slid backward and rolled to the side, revealing a pitch-black tunnel. "Inside." "Quickly," Caleb urged, pulling her into the darkness just as the first lantern lights of the Pinkerton agents breached the canyon below. As soon as they crossed the threshold, Caleb pulled a heavy lever concealed in the rock wall. The massive stone door ground shut behind them, sealing off the howling blizzard and the barking dogs completely. The silence was sudden and absolute, but it wasn't cold. Josephine fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The air in the tunnel was impossibly warm, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming orchids and rich earth. It made no sense. They were over 10,000 feet above sea level in the middle of a Colorado winter. Caleb struck a match, touching the flame to a series of grooved sconces carved into the walls. As the fire caught, a brilliant, luminescent blue flame rushed down the length of the tunnel, illuminating their surroundings. Josephine stopped breathing. The walls of the cavern were not rough stone. They were meticulously carved with intricate, sweeping glyphs and murals, depicting men riding massive birds and cities that floated above the clouds. Embedded in the walls were massive raw veins of the exact same blue-gold ore Caleb had used to pay Caldwell. The tunnel glowed with a magical, ethereal light. "What? What is this place?" Josephine asked, her voice trembling. "Who built this?" Caleb stood tall, stripping away the wet, heavy wolf skins. Underneath, he didn't wear the ragged long johns of a poor miner. He wore a finely woven tunic of a deep, royal crimson, clasped with a metal insignia that matched the glyphs on the wall. The dirt and grime of the town seemed to melt away from him, revealing a man of regal, commanding presence. "My ancestors built it," Caleb said, his grammar shifting from the gruff, broken drawl of a mountain man to perfect aristocratic articulation. "Before the Spanish came, before the Americans drew lines on a map and called it Colorado. This is the outer gate of Ethelgard." He offered her his hand. Josephine, trembling not from the cold but from utter awe, took it. He led her to the end of the tunnel, where a vast balcony of white stone jutted out into open air. Josephine stepped out and fell to her knees. They were no longer looking at snowy peaks. The tunnel had led them completely through the mountain range, emerging on the edge of a colossal, hidden caldera. The clouds formed a thick, rolling ocean below them, but piercing through the clouds were towering spires of white marble and shimmering blue glass. Lush, vibrant green terraces cascaded down the sides of the crater, fed by steaming geothermal waterfalls. It was a thriving, ancient metropolis hidden in the sky, entirely concealed from the outside world by a ring of impassable mountains. "You aren't a beggar, are you, Caleb?" Josephine whispered, unable to take her eyes off the impossible city. Caleb knelt beside her, his ice-blue eyes softening. "I am the Sentinel, the last prince of a forgotten sky. For 10 years I walked among the people below, watching the sickness of greed destroy the land, searching for one soul that valued honor over silver." He gently lifted her chin. "You offered your life to save your fathers, Josephine. You married a beggar. Now, I welcome you to your kingdom." But as the magnificent golden sun broke over the spires of the secret city, a low, booming echo thudded from the heavy stone door they had left miles behind. Caldwell's men had brought dynamite. The outside world was knocking on the door of paradise, and the true battle was only just beginning. The concussive boom of the dynamite ripped through the serene, warm air of the hidden caldera like a physical blow. The vibration shattered the absolute stillness of the ancient city, sending flocks of vibrantly plumed birds shrieking into the rolling ocean of clouds below. Josephine clamped her hands over her ears, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The massive stone door, miles back through the mountain's heart, had been breached. The outside world, a world of iron, black powder, and insatiable greed, was bleeding into paradise. Caleb's ice-blue eyes darkened to the color of a winter storm. He did not panic. He simply turned his gaze toward the descending terraces of the city, where the scattered citizens of Ethelgard were emerging from their stone dwellings. There were perhaps only 300 of them left. They were a beautiful, solemn people, dressed in woven silks and fine linens, their skin bearing the same faint, geometric scarifications as Caleb's. They looked up at their prince, their faces etched not with terror, but with a weary resignation. They had been waiting for this day for centuries. "He didn't just follow us," Josephine breathed, the horrifying realization dawning on her as she looked at the sheer complexity of the hidden tunnel. "Caldwell couldn't have tracked us through a blizzard that quickly. He didn't just stumble upon the door, Caleb. He brought dynamite. He knew it was there." "You are a very perceptive woman, Josephine," a voice echoed, not from the tunnel, but from the memories she suddenly pieced together. She remembered Caldwell in her father's study months ago, poring over antiquated Spanish maps, obsessing over a lost diary. "The Castaneda manuscript," she gasped, grabbing Caleb's arm. "Pedro de Castaneda, the chronicler for Coronado's 1540 expedition. My father acquired a torn fragment of his journal from a drifter in Santa Fe. It spoke of a city above the clouds in the San Juans, built by a tribe that possessed stones of blue fire. Caldwell bought it from my father. That's why he bankrupted him. He wasn't after my father's mercantile. He wanted the deed to the high pass because it contained the entrance to the mountain." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And he used you as bait. He knew I traded in Creed. He knew I watched you. He engineered the public spectacle in the mud because he knew I would not let you be sold like cattle. He needed me to open the gate." The betrayal cut deeper than the freezing wind of the mountains. Josephine had thought her sacrifice was an act of rebellion. Instead, she had been a pawn in Arthur Caldwell's monstrous colonial game. He had weaponized her desperation. "They have breached the outer sanctum, my lord," an elder of Ethelgard said, ascending the white marble stairs. He carried a long, elegantly curved blade, forged entirely from the shimmering blue-gold Ethereum. "The intruders are heavily armed. They possess repeating rifles and the explosive powder." "How many?" Caleb asked, his voice ringing with the authority of a king preparing for war. 50 men, led by the one they call Canton, the mercenary with the cold eyes. Josephine's blood ran cold. Frank Canton. He was a notorious real-life enforcer for the Wyoming stock growers, a ruthless gunman who specialized in quiet massacres. Caldwell had spared no expense, hiring the deadliest man in the West to slaughter a peaceful, ancient civilization for their gold. "We seal the glass bridge," Caleb commanded. "Move the women and children to the upper geyser chambers. Arm the sentinels." He turned to Josephine, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The rough mountain man from the muddy streets of Creed was entirely gone, replaced by a sovereign of devastating nobility. "I brought you here to save you, Josephine. I did not mean to drag you into a massacre. You must hide in the temple." "No," Josephine said, her voice trembling but her emerald eyes blazing with an unprecedented fire. "I am the one who gave them the path. I am your wife, under the laws of the world below, Caleb. I will not cower while my husband's kingdom bleeds." Caleb stared at her, an unspoken reverence passing between them. The arranged, desperate marriage, born in the dirt of a silver town, had alchemized into something profound and unbreakable. He reached to his hip, drawing a slender, perfectly balanced Ethereum dagger from his belt, and placed it in her hands. "Then stand with me, Queen of the Clouds," he whispered. The siege of Ethelgard began not with a battle cry, but with the deafening chatter of a Gatling gun. The Pinkerton mercenaries poured out from the tunnel entrance at the far end of the caldera, dragging the heavy artillery piece behind them. The ancient silence of the city was torn to shreds as heavy lead-caliber bullets chewed through the millennia-old marble pillars. Caleb's warriors, the sentinels, moved with terrifying, fluid grace. They did not use firearms. They used the environment. Using mechanisms built into the stone, they unleashed jets of scalding, high-pressure geothermal steam from the terraces, blinding and burning the advancing mercenaries. Ethereum-tipped arrows rained down from the high balconies, piercing thick canvas coats and taking down Canton's men with silent precision. But there were too many. The sheer, brutal industrial force of the 19th century was overpowering the elegant defenses of the ancients. Josephine crouched behind a shattered fountain, the smell of cordite and copper blood mixing sickeningly with the scent of crushed orchids. She watched in horror as Frank Canton, tall and unblinking, calmly raised his Winchester and shot 2 sentinels from the terrace above. Beside him, Arthur Caldwell emerged from the smoke, his eyes wide with a maniacal, feverish greed as he looked at the veins of blue gold glowing in the city walls. "Kill the men!" Caldwell screamed over the gunfire, his tailored coat now smeared with ash. "Take the woman alive. She is the legal deed holder of the pass. With her alive, this land belongs to the railroad." "They are pushing toward the glass bridge," Caleb said, appearing beside her, his crimson tunic slashed and bleeding at the shoulder. "If they cross the central chasm, they will reach the civilian chambers. We have to break the bridge." "It's solid Ethereum-laced stone," Josephine said, looking at the breathtaking span that crossed a lethal, 1,000-foot drop into the boiling volcanic vents below. "How do we break it?" "We don't," Caleb replied, his eyes locking onto the crate of dynamite the Pinkertons had abandoned near the tunnel entrance when the steam vents had activated. "They do." The plan was a desperate, suicidal gamble. Josephine, utilizing her heavy canvas coat to blend into the shadows of the rock formations, crept along the outer rim of the terrace. The gunfire was deafening, the air thick with gray smoke that choked her lungs. Down below, Caleb and his remaining sentinels formed a tight, defensive phalanx at the center of the glass bridge, drawing the entirety of the mercenary force toward them. Caldwell saw Caleb standing on the bridge and laughed, a cruel, echoing sound. "Look at the mountain ghost, a savage playing dress-up. Canton, sweep them off the bridge. I want the gold secured by nightfall." Canton signaled his men. 30 heavily armed mercenaries stepped onto the bridge, their rifles raised, preparing for a firing squad execution. They didn't see Josephine. She had reached the abandoned crate. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled 3 heavy sticks of dynamite from the sawdust, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the blasting caps. Growing up the daughter of a mercantile supplier in a mining town, she knew exactly how to rig a short fuse. She had sold hundreds of them to prospectors. She struck a match against the stone. The fuse hissed to life, spitting sparks. With a feral cry that tore her throat, Josephine sprinted from the shadows, running directly toward the rear of the mercenary line. "Arthur!" she screamed. Caldwell spun around. His eyes widened as he saw his helpless, captive bride running toward him, a burning bundle of explosives in her hands. "Shoot her!" Caldwell shrieked, his refined facade completely shattering into cowardly panic. But Canton hesitated. Caldwell's previous orders had been clear. She was the legal deed holder. Killing her complicated the railroad's claim. In that single, fatal second of hesitation, Josephine hurled the dynamite not at the men, but at the ancient, stress-bearing Keystone Arch at the base of the glass bridge. "Caleb, now!" she screamed. Caleb did not hesitate. He and his sentinels threw themselves backward, leaping from the bridge toward the safety of the far terrace, using their grappling lines to swing into the hanging gardens. The dynamite detonated. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. The blast wave knocked Josephine off her feet, sending her skidding across the rough marble floor. The ancient keystone, already stressed by millennia, shattered into a million glowing blue fragments. A horrifying groan ripped through the caldera. The glass bridge, along with 30 Pinkerton mercenaries, Frank Canton, and Arthur Caldwell, collapsed. It was as if the earth had opened its jaws. The screams of the men were swallowed by the roaring abyss as thousands of tons of stone, glass, and human greed plummeted into the boiling geothermal vents 1,000 feet below. The sound of the impact was a muted, distant thunder, followed by a massive plume of white steam that rose up and washed over the broken edge of the chasm. Then, there was only the wind. Josephine lay on her back, her ears ringing, staring up at the painfully blue Colorado sky. The smoke slowly cleared. Footsteps approached her. Caleb knelt beside her. He was battered, covered in ash and blood, but he was alive. He looked down at the empty air where the bridge had been, and then at the woman who had just brought the wrath of the mountains down upon their enemies. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently wiping a streak of black soot from her cheek. "You destroyed the only path back to your world," he said softly. The tunnel entrance was now completely inaccessible, separated by a massive, uncrossable chasm. Josephine looked into his ice-blue eyes. She saw the centuries of loneliness there, the heavy burden of a king who had lost his kingdom to time. But she also saw an endless, unwavering devotion. The town of Creed, the muddy streets, the ledger books, the debts, they belonged to a ghost. She was no longer a merchant's daughter traded to settle a score. She placed her hand over his. The heat of his skin anchored her. "That world traded me for a piece of dirt," Josephine whispered, pulling herself up to press her forehead against his. "This is my world now, with you." Caleb wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. Around them, the surviving citizens of Ethelgard emerged from the smoke. They did not cheer. They simply bowed, dropping to one knee in the ash-covered marble, acknowledging the terrifying, beautiful outsider who had sacrificed her past to secure their future. The secret kingdom in the clouds remained hidden. As the years passed, the legend of the mountain ghost and the vanished bride of Creed faded into the folklore of the Wild West, dismissed as a tall tale whispered by drunken miners. No one ever found the gold. No one ever found Arthur Caldwell. But high above the timberline, beyond the reach of maps and the greed of men, the blue fires of Ethelgard burned bright. Josephine and Caleb ruled not with iron, but with the quiet strength of the mountains, a king and queen bound by a bargain in the mud, reigning over an empire touched only by the stars. They lived out their days in the warm embrace of the caldera, their love story etched into the very stones of the earth, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are not mined from the rock, but forged in the wild, untamed chambers of the human heart. If you loved this breathtaking tale of Wild West romance, hidden empires, and ultimate betrayal, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who crave epic historical dramas, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, immersive stories of lost worlds and fierce love. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Let us know in the comments, would you have traded it all for a kingdom in the clouds?